The doctor hurried across the corridor, his stethoscope swinging around his neck and his military base badge hanging from his impeccably white coat. Fort Bradley Military Hospital was never truly quiet, but that morning the murmur seemed more tense, as if the entire building were only breathing halfway. Outside, the North Carolina winter sky was gray, and the helicopters landing and taking off formed a constant background noise, a reminder that the war might be far away, but its consequences lived within. At the nursing station, a young woman with brown hair tied in a simple bun organized medical records with the attention of someone who knew that each piece of paper represented a life. Her name tag read, Nurse Hannah Miller, but almost no one called her by her name. To most, she was just the quiet nurse. She spoke little, kept a reserved gaze, and always did what she was told. She seemed invisible, unless someone needed something. Dr. Ethan Collins approached the counter. Without even glancing at her, he was irritated once again. The previous night had been long, filled with complex cases and bureaucratic demands. And, as always, it was easier to vent some of his frustration on someone who didn't react. "Where are Sergeant Walker's blood test results?" he asked, without greeting. "I requested them over an hour ago." Hannah wasn't offended by the tone. He simply took a deep breath, turned a page in the notebook in front of him, and pointed to a metal tray. "They're here, Doctor. Exer arrived 15 minutes ago. I organized them by priority. Sergeant Walker is at the top." Ethan took the exams without thinking. He flipped through the papers and grimaced. "If you had let me know as soon as you arrived, I would have adjusted his medication already." He glanced quickly at her, as if assessing a poorly adjusted piece of equipment. "You need to be more proactive, nurse. Medicine doesn't wait for those who stay silent." Hannah felt her face flush, but she kept a neutral gaze. She knew he was speaking loudly enough for others to hear. One of the residents whispered something to another, trying to hide a smile. Ethan's reputation for being demanding, sarcastic, and brilliant spread throughout the hospital. His, on the other hand, was that of someone who accepted everything in silence. "I was in Lieutenant Brooks's room, Doctor," she replied calmly. "He was in a severe pain crisis. I administered the medication, monitored his vital signs, and then returned to the station. It was during that time that the results came in. As soon as I returned, I separated them." Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested in the explanation. "Then come back faster next time," he murmured, turning to leave. "Pain doesn't kill in 5 minutes. Internal bleeding does." He stepped away, and the muffled laughter of one of the residents cut through the air. Hannah pretended not to hear. She put away the pad, checked the names on the identification bracelets listed on the computer, and stood up. He had one more round of checks to do on Wednesdays. As she walked down the hallway, her posture erect and her steps silent, she felt the weight of that routine accumulating on her shoulders. It wasn't physical exhaustion. Her body had already grown accustomed to the shifts, the irregular hours, and the lack of sleep. It was something else, the feeling that no one there had any idea who she was or what she carried within her. On her left wrist, right where her lab coat ended, the beginning of a design in black ink would sometimes appear when she reached for something. Generally, however, she kept her sleeves closed or positioned her watch at just the right height to hide it. It wasn't shame, it was protection. That small symbol tattooed on her wrist was part of a story she didn't intend to tell lightly. An older nurse, Sharon, appeared from the opposite direction, holding a tray with medication. "Hannah, dear," she said softly. "Don't mind Dr. Collins. Treats everyone like that. The difference is that most people talk back." Hannah gave a small but genuine smile. "Everything's fine, Sharon. He's under pressure." Sharon stopped beside her and sighed. "We're all under pressure. But that doesn't justify disrespect. You do far more for these patients than he realizes." Hannah nodded in thanks and went to room 207, where Lieutenant Brooks, a boy in his early 20s, was reclining on the bed, his gaze still tense, but more relaxed than before. "Hey, Lieutenant," she said in a low but warm voice. "How's the pain now?" He took a deep breath, testing his own limit. "Better ... Much better than before." She smiled briefly. "You have the hands of an angel, you know?" She laughed, but quietly. "Don't overdo it. It was just the medicine taking effect." "It's not just the medicine," he insisted. "The way you talk, the calmness you bring. It helps more than you can imagine." Hannah didn't answer. She preferred not to. Encourage compliments. She noted the information in the medical record, adjusted his pillow, and, before leaving, heard the young man say, "You know, you should talk more. The other nurses are always chatting, laughing, but not you. It's like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders and nobody notices." She paused in the doorway, her back to him for a moment, then she turned her face just enough for him to see a small smile. "Some worlds are better off in silence," he replied, and left. Throughout the morning, the activity increased. A convoy had arrived overnight from an airbase in another state, bringing soldiers wounded in an exercise that had gotten out of control. Broken ribs, burns, minor injuries, some more serious cases. Between orders, reports, and the continuous beeping of heart monitors, the hospital seemed like an anthill. At the end of the corridor, near the conference room, hung a framed display of old photos of the base. Officers from other eras, in black and white, uniforms neatly pressed, expressions rigid. Hannah would often glance at that framed photo, just long enough to remember that much had come before her, and much would come after. That afternoon, however, something different was about to happen. A high-ranking general, known only by his surname Adams in the whispers of the corridors, was arriving at the base for a strategic meeting about expanding the rehabilitation sector. It was an administrative matter, far removed from the routine of those on the front lines of care, but his visit had made everyone more rigid, trying to appear impeccable. Ethan adjusted his lab coat for the third time as he waited near the main. Beside him, the hospital director, Colonel Turner, mentally reviewed what he would present. Some nurses and assistant officers circulated with restrained steps, as if any noise out of place could be interpreted as a lack of discipline. Hannah wasn't part of the welcoming committee. She was upstairs, checking an IV bag, when she heard the announcement of the general's arrival over the loudspeaker. The metallic voice echoed through the corridors, followed by a brief silence that seemed full of expectation. She wasn't very interested. Generals came and went. Speeches were made, promises were repeated, resources were approved or delayed. Meanwhile, the pain remained the same, the frightened faces too. Her work didn't change with anyone's visit. However, fate sometimes decides that the paths of people who barely notice each other will inevitably cross. An hour later, after the general had been received in the meeting room and the formalities had begun, an attendant hurriedly appeared at the nursing station on the floor where Hannah was. "We need a nurse in the conference room now," he announced, slightly out of breath. "One of the officers has fallen ill. The other nurses were busy with procedures they couldn't interrupt." Sharon looked at Hannah. "You go, Hannah. I'll cover your rooms." She nodded without hesitation. She picked up the first aid kit, quickly checked that she had everything she needed, and followed the attendant down the corridors, descending the stairs with firm steps. Her heart beat a little faster, not from nervousness at the rank of those present, but from the possibility of a sudden emergency anywhere. At times like these, she remembered other situations, in other countries, with the smell of dust, smoke, and blood mixed together. When he entered the conference room, he found a tense atmosphere. In the back, a projector still illuminated a screen displaying budget charts and occupancy rates. On the right side of the room, however, several officers were gathered around a chair. A middle-aged colonel was pale, sweating, and breathing heavily. "Give me some space, please," Hannah said, her voice firm but respectful. The men made way. General Adams was there too, standing, observing with a serious expression. Tall, with gray hair close to his head, impeccable posture. His gaze fell on Hannah for a second, assessing her quickly, and then returned to the colonel. Hannah knelt beside the man, placed the kit on the ground, took his pulse, checked his breathing, and assessed his skin color. It seemed like a case of sudden illness, perhaps a drop in blood pressure, perhaps something more. "Sir, can you hear me?" he asked the colonel, without making a fuss. He made a weak gesture with his head. "I idiot, ... double quotes," he murmured. She began, measuring her blood pressure with automatic movements, analyzing her body's reaction. Everything on her face was concentration. No apparent anxiety, no hesitation, just focus. "Will he be all right?" a voice asked behind him. It was the director, Colonel Turner. "His blood pressure is low, but not dangerously so. Hannah replied, still working. I'll put him in a more suitable position, hydrate him, and monitor him. It was probably the stress combined with the heat in the room. But, as a precaution, it would be ideal to take him to the observation ward. The colonel tried to protest, saying he was fine, but Hannah didn't give him a chance. With all due respect, sir, your health is not just yours. It's also the health of the institution and of the men who depend on your decisions. She indicated the stretcher that an attendant had brought. We'll take you there. General Adams observed her every gesture. There was something in the way she moved, how she gave clear orders without raising her voice, that caught his attention. It wasn't just standard training, it was something shaped by real experience. As the colonel was being lowered onto the stretcher, Hannah stood up, adjusting the kit back on the strap. The sleeve of her lab coat rode up slightly, revealing part of the tattoo on her wrist. The design was discreet, in black, a symbol formed by a circle with a small stylized wing on the left and 3 curved lines on the right, like radio waves. It was only a moment, but for General Adams, that moment seemed to last longer. His eyes fixed on her wrist. For a moment, the world narrowed. His breathing became heavier. He knew that symbol. Not from theory, not from a book, but from vivid memory. Hannah noticed his gaze and, reflexively, pulled her sleeve down. Not out of guilt, but out of habit. She never imagined that anyone there could recognize her. "What's your name, nurse?" the general asked, his voice deeper than before. She turned to him, surprised to be directly addressed by someone at that level of hierarchy. "Hannah Miller, sir." He kept staring at the sleeve of the lab coat, as if trying to see through the fabric. "Have you served in another unit before?" he asked, more slowly, as if treading on familiar but delicate ground. Hannah hesitated for a second, weighing whether it was worth saying or not. In the manual, the answer would be simple. "Yes, sir. I served as a military nurse in such and such a place." But the story behind that symbol was more complex. "I serve it, sir," he replied, maintaining a neutral tone. "On foreign missions." Ethan, who had entered the room to see what was happening, observed everything from afar. When they heard that an officer had fallen ill, he introduced himself. But upon arriving, he saw that the quiet nurse had already taken control of the situation. And, to worsen his discomfort, he saw the general speaking directly to her, with an interest he rarely showed in someone of her stature. "She's just a nurse on the local medical staff, sir," said the director, trying to keep the conversation within formal boundaries. "Very competent, of course, but I believe the records database can provide more details about her history, if you're interested." General Adams never took his eyes off Hannah. "It's not just nothing," he murmured, "and I don't need the database to recognize what I've already seen in the field." He took a step forward. "Hannah Miller, please lift the sleeve of your lab coat." A heavy silence fell over the room. The officers exchanged confused glances. Ethan crossed his arms, trying to decipher the situation. Hannah felt her heart beat a little faster, but she obeyed. He pulled the sleeve of his left wrist up almost to the middle of his forearm, revealing the tattoo in full. The symbol was now clearly visible to everyone. Some recognized nothing more than a strange design. Others, who had served on secret missions or coordinated joint operations with special units, felt a chill. It was the unofficial emblem of Echo Phoenix, a small medical tactical rescue team that had operated in extremely high-risk conflict zones. A unit that, officially, barely existed. And when mentioned, it was always in hushed tones. General Adams took a deep breath. "I last saw this symbol at a makeshift field hospital across the ocean," he said, his voice heavy enough to make several straighten up. "The Echo Phoenix team evacuated an entire village under crossfire. A helicopter crashed during that operation. Some of you might not have survived." Ethan felt the ground briefly give way beneath. Echo Phoenix. He only knew of it from rumors. Stories about medical teams entering areas where even combat units didn't want to be, rescuing civilians, soldiers, and anyone else caught in the chaos. And there, in front of him, the nurse he called quiet wore the symbol of that unit on her wrist. Hannah kept her gaze steady, even as she felt memories she preferred to keep locked away knocking at the door of her mind. She remembered the night the helicopter crashed, the heat of the flames, the smell of fuel, the scream of a comrade trapped between twisted metal. She remembered trembling hands, the blood flowing, the second she thought she was going to die, and the voice that even then pushed her forward. "Keep going." There are people waiting for you. Some survived, sir, she said simply. Others didn't, but everyone did the best they could. The general nodded slowly. His gaze softened, as if he had just found a fragment of a past he hadn't expected to encounter again. That helicopter was carrying more than just wounded Miller, he commented, his voice now carrying a personal tone. It was also carrying a vital intelligence archive. If it weren't for the medical team's efforts in keeping those soldiers alive until the evacuation point, we would have lost much more than lives. We would have lost the chance to prevent a greater massacre. He turned slightly toward the director and doctor in this unit. Echo Phoenix wasn't just made up of ordinary soldiers, they were people who could have chosen quiet posts, but volunteered to go into hell alongside the wounded. Ethan felt his face burn. Each sentence seemed a direct reminder of how much he had underestimated that woman. He remembered all the times he had treated her with disdain, the brusque orders, the loud criticisms. He thought about how she never stood up for herself, never raised her voice, and now he was discovering that she had worked in conditions he could barely imagine. Nurse Miller, the general continued, why didn't you mention your history at Echo Phoenix on the local forms? I didn't see any reference to it in the dossier I received before coming here. She took a deep breath. You know how this information is handled, he replied. Many of these operations remain classified, and the way they are officially recorded is limited. Besides, when I returned, I just wanted to work, to do what I've always done, without drawing attention. The general stared at her for a few more seconds, as if trying to read the layers of silence that existed there. Sometimes, hiding who you are ends up depriving others of learning from it, she said, without an accusatory tone, just an observation. He then turned to Colonel Turner. Colonel, this hospital has someone on its nursing staff who has already worked in one of the most critical situations our forces have faced in recent years. It would be wise to take advantage of that experience, instead of keeping it hidden behind a nursing station and sarcastic comment. The blow struck directly at Ethan's pride. Even though the general hadn't mentioned his name, the doctor felt the words as a veiled reprimand. He, who liked to be recognized for his expertise and intelligence, now realized he was facing a professional who had endured trials far beyond those he had. Over the following days, the news spread through the hospital, even though no one openly admitted to knowing. People whispered in the hallways, the cafeteria, the break room. Did you hear about Nurse Miller's tattoo? They said the general recognized a secret unit symbol on her wrist. Could it be true? Hannah pretended not to notice the change in their glances. It was subtle, but real. Some were more respectful, some curious, some even seemed uncomfortable. She was still focused on her work, trying not to let it change how she cared for each patient. Even so, at times, alone in the locker room or sitting on an outside bench during breaks, I would close my eyes and let the memories come, one by one, like waves. She remembered when she had decided to enlist in the Armed Forces Medical Corps, still very young, motivated not by blind patriotism, but by a deep desire to be where the pain was real, where help was urgent. She also remembered her mother's, her father's resistance, both living in a small suburb in rural Ohio without imagining what a war zone was like, except from the news on television. When she was selected to join the Echo Phoenix team, she already had several years of experience in military hospitals, but nothing had prepared her for what she would find. Destroyed villages, wounded children, soldiers trembling not from cold, but from trauma. And yet, amidst the destruction, small gestures of humanity, someone sharing water, another offering their own coat to a stranger, an elderly woman holding her hands and whispering words in a language she didn't understand, but whose emotional meaning was clear: gratitude. It was there, in that setting, that the symbol of the wing and the waves had been created, first drawn on a sheet of paper, then engraved in leather. It was not an official emblem, but a silent oath among those who carried it, never to abandon anyone behind, even when everything crumbled. Back in the reality of the hospital, in Fort Bradley, Hannah was trying to reconcile these two worlds within herself. The noisy past, full of explosions and sirens, and the present, where the constant sound was the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the whispers of nurses and doctors. There was something ironic there. Many saw her quietness as weakness, when in fact, it was what remained after surviving the chaos. A week after the general's visit, a specific case would bring the invisible lines connecting Hannah's hidden past to the present even closer. A group of soldiers, recently returned from advanced training in another state, were admitted to the hospital after a road accident. No combat, no covert operation, just a bus that skidded on a wet road, reminding everyone that risk wasn't limited to foreign lands. Among the injured was a young lieutenant, his eyes trembling with frightened expressions, superficial cuts, and his arm immobilized. Ethan was in the emergency room when they arrived. He quickly coordinated the triage, distributed tasks, and gave clear orders. He was, after all, a good doctor. His problem wasn't competent. It was how he treated those he considered below him. Hannah was assigned to care for the young lieutenant named Mark Dawson. While cleaning a wound on his face, she noticed that the young man was trembling slightly. It wasn't just pain, it was fear. "It was so fast," he murmured, trying to maintain his composure. "I was looking out the window, thinking about the presentation I had to give, and suddenly the bus started moving. I heard people shouting. I thought that..." His voice faltered. Hannah gently placed her free hand on his shoulder, conveying firmness. "You're here now," she said softly. "Take a deep breath. Look around. Do you see?" She pointed to the room, to the monitors, to the other professionals. "This place exists precisely for this, to take care of those who have gone through the unexpected." He tried to smile, his eyes still watery. "You don't seem to. Do you get scared, easily, nurse?" She thought for a second. "I've seen a lot," he replied. "This place, however difficult it may be, is still a safe place. All you need to do now is let the team do the work." Across the room, Ethan watched out of necessity. He tried to focus on another patient, but his mind kept returning to the image of the tattoo on Hannah's wrist, to the general's reaction, to the whispered stories he'd heard about Echo Phoenix. To what extent had he been unfair? To what extent had he let his own ego blind him to the value of those who worked alongside him? That night, after the activity subsided, Ethan found Hannah in the hallway, putting medication away in the cabinet. For a moment, he considered simply walking, maintaining a professional distance. But something inside him, for the first time in a long time, was pushing him in another direction. "Nurse Miller," she called. She turned around, slightly surprised. He rarely called her by her name, and when he did, it was usually to demand something. "Yes, doctor?" He held her gaze, searching for words he wasn't used to using. "About what happened in the conference room last week," he began slowly. "I heard what the general said. About the Echo Phoenix unit." He ran a hand over his chin uncomfortably. "I had no idea." Hannah tilted her head without hostility, but also without any expectation of apology. "There was no reason for you to know," he replied. "I was just doing my job there, as I do here." He took a deep breath. "Even so, I should have shown more respect." The words seemed harsh to him, but true. "Not just because of your past, which I didn't know about, but because of your daily work. I was unfair and arrogant." The hallway was silent. A yellowish light descended from the ceiling, casting soft shadows around them. Hannah wasn't used to seeing doctors admitting mistakes so openly. Most preferred to hide behind titles and specializations. "I don't hold grudges, doctor," she said. "Sincerely. War teaches that time spent harboring resentment is time taken away from caring for those who are ahead of you. Even so," he insisted, "I want you to know that I recognize my stance, and I will change it. Not just with you, but with the entire team." He paused. "And if you ever feel comfortable sharing more about what you experienced in that unit, I would like to hear it. Not out of curiosity, but as a learning experience." Hannah thought for a moment. Sharing those memories had never been easy. They weren't stories meant to impress. They were scars in the form of memories. But at the same time, keeping everything locked away was also a burden. "Maybe someday," he said simply, "when the voices I still hear in my head are a little quieter." He nodded, respecting the boundary. Over the following weeks, their relationship changed. They didn't become close friends. The environment and hierarchy still drew clear lines, but mutual respect became evident. Ethan began to listen more to Hannah's recommendations, to ask her opinion on certain cases, and to acknowledge, in front of others, the importance of nursing work. One day, General Adams returned to the hospital to personally oversee a new phase of the rehabilitation project. This time, however, he wasn't greeted with mere formalities. The director, influenced by their previous conversation, had included something different in the program, a brief account of experiences from frontline professionals. When Hannah learned that her name was on the list to speak, her first reaction was to consider refusing. She didn't like being the center of attention. But at the same time, she felt that perhaps it was time to accept that her story could help more people than she imagined. In the conference room, before a small group of officers, doctors, and a few nurses, she stood up. She wore her usual simple lab coat, her hair tied back, the tattoo discreetly visible on her wrist, by choice. General Adams was seated in the front row, attentive. "My name is Hannah Miller," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I'm a nurse at this hospital. Before that, I served in a tactical medical rescue unit in a conflict zone." She didn't mention the name Echo Phoenix, but the general knew, and that was enough. What I want to share today isn't about individual heroism, nor about spectacular acts. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide to stand by pain, even when they have every excuse to run from it. She recounted, in careful and unsensationalist lines, the story of a village evacuated under fire, of a child who held her hand the entire time while the helicopter flew over an unstable area, of a colleague who insisted on going back to retrieve a wounded man whom everyone considered lost and who ultimately survived because of it. She also spoke of the silence that followed when she returned home and realized that, although she was safe, another battle was beginning, learning to live with the memory of what she had seen. "Many people think courage is the absence of fear," he said, looking at the faces before him. "But what I've seen has taught me that courage is doing what needs to be done despite it. Sometimes that means going into a war zone. Other times, it means waking up every day, putting on the scrubs and treating each patient as if they were the only one, even when another day on call seems unbearable." She didn't mention names or specific operations. She respected secrets, boundaries, and protocol. But when she finished, the room seemed different. General Adams stood up and, in an unusual gesture for that place, applauded. Others joined him. Ethan, seated further back, felt a mixture of admiration and humility. He had learned medicine in the best hospitals, read books, and published articles. But he was beginning to understand that there was a kind of knowledge that couldn't be found in libraries, the kind that came from direct contact with human frailty at its extreme. After the presentation, as people dispersed, the general approached Hannah. "You carried this symbol alone for a long time," he said, looking at her wrist. "Now I see that, even in silence, it continued to fulfill its purpose, to remind the world that there are still people willing to stay where it is most difficult." She gave a discreet smile. "I wasn't alone, sir. Not there, not here." She looked around, at the hospital corridor, at the faces of her colleagues. "It just took me a while to realize that, even when nobody knows your story, it continues to guide how you work." The general nodded, satisfied. "The base needs people like you, Miller, not just to care for the wounded, but to remind everyone that someone's worth isn't in the noise they make, but in the depth of what they offer." Over time, Hannah's presence at the hospital ceased to be seen as something commonplace. Those who knew her best began to seek her out not only for technical guidance, but also for silent advice. Young nurses arriving insecure, newly graduated doctors struggling to reconcile theory and practice, soldiers in rehabilitation trying to understand how to rebuild their lives outside the field. She didn't have magic answers, but she had something few possessed: the ability to stand beside pain without turning away, without being frightened, without promising easy solutions. Sometimes, on the quietest night, Hannah would leave the hospital after her shift ended and walk to a spot on the base where she could see the city lights in the distance. She would think about the paths that had brought her there, the girl from rural Ohio, the determined young woman who boarded a plane bound for the unknown, the member of a team that almost no one knew by name, the quiet nurse whom an arrogant doctor underestimated. Now she knew that each of these versions of herself remained alive, intertwined, even if others only saw the surface. What the general had done in recognizing the tattoo was not merely identifying a symbol, it was recognizing the history it carried, also forcing others to look at it with new eyes. One night, while reviewing a chart at the nursing station, Hannah noticed Ethan approaching with 2 mugs of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, offering one of the mugs. Night shifts seem longer when the ward is too quiet. She accepted the mug, surprised, and took a sip. "Thank you, doctor. You know you don't have to call me doctor all the time anymore, right?" he said with a half smile. "You can call me Ethan." She thought for a moment. "Okay, Ethan," he said, testing the name. He set his mug down on the counter and looked at the papers in front of it. "You know, sometimes, I think," he began thoughtfully, "if I had known your story before, maybe I would have avoided saying so many stupid things. But, at the same time, maybe I needed the shock of the general, the tattoo, that whole scene, to see things clearly." Hannah stared at him for a moment. "Stories don't exist to make anyone comfortable," he replied. "They exist to remind us that people are greater than the labels they receive. Quiet nurse, arrogant doctor, distant general. In the end, everyone is fighting a battle that others don't see." He smiled, a genuine smile. "So, I suppose I should strive to be something more than the label I've created for myself as well." "He's already doing that," she said simply. As she left her shift that morning, the hospital lights faded, and Hannah felt that for the first time in a long time, the weight in her chest was different. It hadn't disappeared. Scars don't fade easily, but it had transformed. It was no longer just the weight of someone carrying a silent past, it was also the responsibility of someone whose story was beginning to illuminate the path for others. Inside, between white walls and long corridors, the symbol on her wrist remained discreet, almost always hidden, sometimes visible. It didn't matter. The general had already recognized it, the doctor had already respected it, her colleagues already felt it reflected in the way she worked, and far beyond the base, in places she might never visit, people like Lieutenant Dawson, Sergeant Walker, the colonel who had fallen ill during the meeting, carried memories of a nurse with a calm voice and firm gaze, who appeared in moments of greatest vulnerability, and acted with the tranquility of someone who had already seen the worst, and yet chose to remain. In that world of patents, lab coats, and reports, where many measured their worth by the volume of their own voice, Hannah's presence was a silent reminder that sometimes true strength doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, doesn't shine under spotlights. It simply stays. It holds a hand. It stabilizes a picture. It sustains a life for a few more minutes, which can make all the difference. The doctor had ridiculed her one day, unknowingly, and the general, upon recognizing the tattoo on her wrist, had shown everyone that what seems small, quiet, and ordinary can hold much meaning, more history, courage, and honor than many loud and clear. That truth continued to echo, even when no one spoke of it, like a silent oath that, in that American hospital, in the middle of a military base, would never be forgotten.